Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. By far, the most requested video we've gotten while in Drydock was a video recording of the complete Drydock tour. We were not going to release this video while we were still conducting tours, but earlier today I gave my last tour of the Drydock. So, since we're going to flood the Drydock in the morning, we're going to walk through right now and do one final Drydock tour. This will be my last time in Drydock with an Iowa-class battleship, possibly forever. At a minimum, though, for many, many years. So I'm going to try not to cry at the end. This Drydock was built between 1917 and 1921 with the Lexington-class battle cruisers in mind. Two of those ships, Constitution and the United States, were under construction here at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. So slipways that could accommodate ships of that size, drydocks that could accommodate ships of that size, were all built here at the Drydock. None of those ships were completed as designed, thanks to the Washington Naval Treaty. However, the infrastructure that went into those ships, like this Drydock, were completed. And so that's one of the reasons why Philadelphia was an ideal shipyard to build 3 of the 6 authorized Iowa-class battleships. This is where New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Illinois were all set to be built. This Drydock is 984 feet long, 114 feet wide at the bottom, 144 feet wide at the top, 50 feet deep, with a foundation 20 foot 6 inches deep below that, and capable of holding about 37 million gallons of water, depending on what level the river is at and how much water the ship is displacing. Now let's head down into the Drydock. Now, if you want a really authentic Drydock tour experience, first of all, turn off all the climate control in your house. Make it as absolutely hot as possible in there. Next, go outside and get as much mud as possible. Cover your feet in it and just sit there in that mud for the next hour. Finally, have one of your housemates go into the kitchen and just start beating on pots and pans until you're finished watching this video. That will give you a really good idea of what the average Drydock tour was like. Bonus points if you have any epoxy paint around your house, if you could just like huff that for the next 30 minutes or so. Chef's kiss, that's what it's like to be in a Drydock. I really hope you got the chance to come out and see the battleship in Drydock, because seeing it on film just is not the same. But from down here, everybody's always in awe of the sheer size of this ship that we built right here in Philadelphia over 80 years ago. For my tours, things varied depending on what stage of the project we were in. So obviously early on we were talking about the original system of coatings and the process of blasting it off. Later on in the project, we were talking about the work that had already been done. So the content changed throughout, and this tour being done at the end of dry dock is going to focus more on the work that has been done and less about design features of the ship, although we'll point out some of them as we go. But from back here, you get an idea of one of the first projects that we worked on, which is the ship's propellers. We were concerned by what condition the propellers would be in when we pulled the ship out of the water. Would the steel around them be heavily corroded? Would the paint have been flaked off? Would the anodes have been destroyed? None of that came true. In fact, the Navy had painted over the propellers and then isolated them from the rest of the hull with some rubber sheeting wrapped in fiberglass, and that seems to have done a tremendous job. Furthermore, while we were worried about the depth of the water behind the ship, we found that the ship potentially touching the bottom at low tide had not caused any damage. The rudders and propellers are not torn up at the bottom, and they're not dented, and they weren't transmitting shock through the hull like we feared might have been the case. So we decided to leave them on board, and so we duplicated the work that the Navy did on them. We rewrapped them in fiberglass. The fiberglass that the Navy put on was leaking. Those free flood areas had managed to flood over the last 30 years, and ours will too. But if by doing this work buys us 10 or 20 more years before it happens, then that's 10 or 20 years less corrosion that's happening in those spaces before we get her to dry dock next. Likewise, the Navy had painted the propellers. We redid the paint on the propellers. We're doing everything we can to isolate them from the steel part of the ship. And it seems like between that and the impressed current cathodic protection system in our berth, that has been enough to maintain the ship. And so we're leaving the ship intact in that regard. Likewise, back here you can see the ship's rudders. The rudders are hollow, and they have a number of fittings in them. So we took some of those fittings out, hooked them up with air to air test the rudders. They weren't leaking, they were able to hold air, and so we basically sealed them back up and painted them again, and that's going to be all the maintenance that those require for the next 30 years. Come on back into the Holland Tunnel next. So from here, there are 6 major projects I want to talk about. We started this dry docking period with 3 things in mind that we wanted to do: painting the bottom of the ship, replacing the anodes, and checking all the through-hull openings. And on top of that, we added boxing in the propeller shafts, doubler plates, and caulk. And I'm going to tell you about each of those 6 things somewhere along the side of the ship as we're going through our tour. First, let's talk about some of the doubler plates we did. Back here in the Holland Tunnel, there were some openings to free flood areas that access where the propeller shafts are coupled together. We no longer need to access those, and they were bolted together and then covered in caulk, and that was not enough to keep the water out. We thought we could do it better with doubler plates. So we welded doubler plates over all of that, and this is a really good change for us as a museum, because 1, it helps keep the water out better, but 2, it's entirely reversible. We go through and we cut those welds, remove those plates, and the ship is right back to the way she was when we found her. So if she has to be returned to service, if we want to make our artifact original again, that is something that we can do thanks to just doing doubler plates. There's one other place along the hull that we did doubler plates that we'll come back to that on later on. But first, let's talk about some other things. I want to show you one ship feature while we're in here. So back here, I want to point out some of the ship's many keels. The first is the centerline keel here. Very little known, but that is the keel extending out and providing a structure for more blocks to sit on, often missed in models and other depictions of the ship. The keel is 2 inches thick STS plate, so it's armor, and it is 4 feet wide for most of the length of the ship. Also back here, we're sitting in between the skegs that hold the inboard propellers. Those are known as the twin docking keels. While not a keel like the centerline keel that's used to support the framing of the ship, they're very important for when the ship is docked, when she's sitting on the blocks like she is now. With the weight of the armor, particularly a steering box around the rudders, turret 3, some of the other structures back here at the stern of the ship, it was critical that there be some structure back here that supports those. And so the US Navy chose these twin docking keels, and this possibly created some vibration issue for the ship, but definitely helped with the maneuverability of the ship, forcing water over the rudders, and helped the ship support herself in dry dock. So these are what allow the ship to sit here without having her stern third just break off, or without having to have docking blocks that are 3 stories tall to reach the underside of the ship. We've now come out from under the center line of the ship, and we are on the starboard side. Our tours typically only went down either the starboard side or the port side, and it varied from week to week depending on where the work was happening. So depending on when you came out for your tour, you might have gone down one side or the other, but it was the same tour either way. The ship is certainly not symmetrical, but she's close enough that we're just going to do one side for the tour. Another major project that we worked on back here at the stern of the ship was boxing in the propeller shafts. So for the outboard shafts directly above us here, you can see that there is a kind of pitted structure where the black propeller shaft comes out of, and then you can see that there's a smooth band that's maybe 2 feet wide just there between the red and the black. It is painted red right now. So that is the box that we welded on. One side is welded to the ship's hull, the other side is welded to the black propeller shaft. And that is closing off what had been a free flood area, allowing water to sit against the gland seal inside the ship. Over time, these gland seals were going to fail. And boxing in the shafts, I think, is the most important thing that we've done in dry dock outside of the stuff we came in here to do, painting the ship and whatnot. So that is a key project that I think our successors 30 years down the line are not going to curse us for doing or leaving undone. So that was one of the projects that we added on. Here's a great place to talk about one of the projects that we initially came in here to do. There's roughly 160 through-hull openings in the ship. These are everything from the propeller shafts exiting the hull, to cooling water getting into the condensers for the engines, fire main water getting into the ship, or sanitary water being pumped out. So here you can see one of the blanks that the Navy put over those through-hull openings in 1990 when the ship was being deactivated. These blanks are 1/4-inch steel, and some of them had already failed as recently as 7 years ago. So, knowing that in 2016 or 2017 at some point, one of these had already failed, and knowing that there were 160 other ones that were more or less identical, they come in different sizes, but they're all made of the same material, we weren't sure when the next major one was going to fail, letting water into the inside of the ship. So, one of the core projects was air testing all of these. We had to drill a hole, pump them full of compressed air, and then see if it held pressure. About half of them held pressure, which means they were airtight and therefore watertight. Half of them did not hold pressure, so we had to do a further test. This was called the soap and blow. We sprayed it with soapy water, and if we saw bubbles being blown out of there, then there was a hole that the air was escaping from on the outside of the ship. If we did not see bubbles, that meant that the hole was on the inside of the ship that the air was escaping out of, and not a concern of ours. While we're in dry dock, we are exclusively working on the exterior below water parts of the ship. It's just too round of a number, but just to give you an idea, it costs something like $25,000 a day just to have the ship on the blocks here in the dry dock, even on days when we're not doing work. So we are not sitting the ship here to do work inside the ship or above water. So the places where the air is leaking into the ship from these through-hull openings are stuff we'll worry about when we get back to Camden. The air is not leaking in from the outside, and so water can't leak in from the outside, which means that we've accomplished our goal. Let's head down the ship some more. Here you can see one of the sections on the hull where we replaced the anodes. We removed all of the original zinc anodes and replaced them with a new aluminum anode. This anode is going to be much better for the Delaware River environment that we've got the ship berthed in, as opposed to the original anodes, which performed better in spaces like Bremerton, Washington, where the Navy mothballed the ship. The anodes we removed were relatively intact. I would say they were 90% or better, which means that they weren't providing any protection for the ship. And realistically, we're not going to count on these doing much protection for the ship either, because we've got an impressed current system in our berth. This is one of those belt and suspender things that we're doing. The impressed current system could fail at any time, and we really only inspect it quarterly, and we only have an expert come out about once every year or so to really tell us it's still working or not. So especially as that system gets older, it's going to be good to have a system on the hull for just in case we start to get more electrical issues in the ship or the impressed current system fails. These new anodes should help preserve the ship for a long period of time. Each one is bolted on so that if they do start to deteriorate, we can send divers down and unbolt them and bolt on new ones. If we did not have an impressed current system, I would expect these anodes to last about 10 years, but this yard period is supposed to last for 30 years. So replacing these in situ may be a distinct possibility somewhere down the line. Future underwater surveys will reveal how necessary that is, though. Each one of these anodes is 20 pounds of aluminum, which means that it is made out of approximately 650 recycled beer cans. Thank you for doing your part to support Battleship New Jersey. All right, next let's go look at a section of the bilge keel. The bilge keels were pretty badly damaged throughout the ship's career, both from corrosion, but also from collision. There are sections of the bilge keel that are badly dented, which show that the ship hit something at various times in her service life. And we've got further proof of this, visible right here, where you can see in 1987 they welded on long sections of patches. And this new metal is very obviously different from the other metal around it. For one, it's not badly pitted like the older metal, and for two, it's welded on instead of riveting. This also reveals one of the reasons why we're avoiding welded repairs as much as possible, especially near riveted parts of the ship. Welding near riveting causes the metal to expand, which pops the rivets. We don't rivet steel anymore. There are still teams on the Great Lakes, but it would be much more expensive to bring them down here to make these repairs, so you would plug weld them. But that may cause more steel to expand and pop more rivets. That was certainly an issue that the Navy ran into 40 years ago in the 80s. Now it's time to talk about the third of the project we came in the yard to do, repainting the hull of the ship. We had to paint approximately 125,000 square feet of underwater hull with 3 coats of paint. This required somewhere around 3,800 gallons or 18 tons of paint, which means for this project we put on 3 tons of aluminum, 4 tons of steel, and 18 tons of paint. The system of coatings is designed to last for a long period of time. It is especially effective in things like water tanks inside of ships, so things that are permanently flooded that will likely never be repainted within the life of the ship because of how inaccessible they are. Because we don't have issues with marine growth this far up the Delaware River, we selected this for the exterior part of the ship because it will last long term and it's not as expensive as an anti-fouling coat. We put the paint on about 30 mils thick. A mil is about 1/1000th of an inch. Not about, a mil is 1/1000th of an inch, which means that we have 0.03 inches of paint, roughly, on the hull of the ship. This is about 5 times thicker than the coat of paint on your car that's designed to last 20 years. This will both protect the steel over the long term and prevent abrasion from wearing off enough of the paint that the steel becomes exposed. The paint went on in 3 different colors. This was done intentionally so we can see what's already been painted and what hasn't. It made it real easy for the painters and then for the paint inspections to verify the number of coatings that were on the ship. And it's going to be real important for myself and my successors in the years going forward in determining just how intact this system of coatings still is. If in 5 years the red and gray paint has already started to wear away and we're starting to see tan paint underneath, well, that means that this system of coatings is not lasting. We've got to start saving money for another yard period. If, however, after 25 years, we're still seeing mostly red paint, and maybe we don't need to go into dry dock again in 2055, maybe we can put it back until 2060 or 2065. Again, much like the condition of the anodes and other parts of the ship, underwater surveys that we conduct in the future will help us identify the need for future work. While there's 3 coats of paint below water, the wind water line, an area about 3 feet above water and 3 feet below water, has 5 coats of paint, about 50 mils thick. So those coats come in the colors of tan, gray, red, and gold and black. Next up, we're going to travel under the ship and see some of the blocking that holds the ship up. Follow me. One of the biggest questions we've gotten throughout this process is how do we paint the part of the ship that's covered by the blocks? We started off with about 304 blocks, but now we are down to 291. We had to remove various blocks to access other parts of the hull for various projects. But we don't have to remove all the blocks. About 3/4 of the way through the project, we were able to refloat the ship, move her 4 feet forward, and then set her down again. That exposed the roughly 12,000 square feet, or 10% of the hull, that had been covered by these blocks, allowing us to paint the entire ship. So, from here you can see the biggest mystery that we ran into in dry dock, and that is the caulk that goes over all the riveted seams. As far as I was able to ascertain, none of our sister ships have this. So we spent the first month in dry dock trying to figure out why we had it Was it important? And what was it? Is it a caulk? Is it an adhesive? Is it a sealant? Like, what is it supposed to be doing? So what product can we replace it with if we even need to spend the money to replace it with? Finally, we figured out that during the 1990 yard period, they made a change order request to try and fix a water intrusion problem in the fuel tanks. Because the ship was being decommissioned, they didn't try to locate the exact problem and spend the money to fix it. They just caulked over all the riveted seams, assuming that that was how the water was leaking into the ship. That means that they put roughly 3 nautical miles of caulk on the ship, about 18,000 linear feet. And we had to track that material down in enough quantity that could get here within about a week so we could start applying it to the ship. Since the Navy thought it was important, and since by that point we were so far into the yard period that we ourselves could not find a permanent solution to the possible water intrusion problem that they had called for, because the caulk had lasted long and we had not seen the same water intrusion problem that the Navy had apparently documented in documents that we have not yet found. So this is one of the few things that we're putting the Band-Aid back on and leaving it for our successor's successor in 30 years to plan into the scope of work, finding out what was causing the problem and finding a permanent solution for it. We were able to find the exact same product that the Navy used back in 1990, and we were able to get it on relatively short order, and so that product is what we have put back on all the riveted seams. The final major part of this yard period was the stiffener plates we added to the bow of the ship. We conducted an ultrasonic survey of the hull where we did shots through each of the plates to see how thick they still were. On a traditional ship, you would want to replace the whole plate if it was a quarter wasted away. The Navy got a variance for the Iowa-class battleships in the 80s because they're made out of battleship steel. They're a little bit thicker than your average ship. So their variance said that the plates didn't have to be replaced until they were less than half, or excuse me, more than half wasted through. Well, we found a section at the bow on each side of the ship, port and starboard, where the shell plating is about a ½ inch thick, but was coming back as a ¼ inch thick. We inspected both inside and outside to see that the original paint was still there, and it was, which means that it had not corroded any further since the ship was decommissioned. We also were able to see drill marks in the hull from when the Navy had surveyed it. So they drilled to see how thick it was, filled in that drill hole. So they knew that it had wasted away to about a ¼ inch thick, and they didn't make any repairs to it. This was one of those things where we didn't want our successors to curse us for finding out about the problem and not doing anything. So we decided that the best course of action for us was going to be to weld an extra ¼ inch of plate over this area. These stiffener plates, again, can be removed, leaving the ship in her original configuration, but they're also going to provide an abrasion resistance to this part of the hull where we are the absolute thinnest. Further, this means that we did not have to cut out the original historic fabric of the ship, plates that were laid here in 1940 and have been on the ship this entire time, and then replace them with brand new plates. We were able to both keep the original plates and strengthen them back to their original thickness in a way that's completely reversible. So from a curator's point of view, this is the perfect way of preserving this part of the hull. If you haven't felt tiny throughout this whole thing, being here at the bow certainly makes you feel that way. The ship is towering more than 7 stories above us here. But you get a really great view about the figure 8 shape of the hull, really. From the broad deck where there was room for 20mm anti-aircraft guns and the anchors and chains, the hull tapers down to the waterline where it is razor thin for slicing through the water before widening out again below water to create more air to be buoyant here at the front of the ship. Also here, you can see a feature that is unique to USS New Jersey, or rather, a feature that is missing that makes New Jersey unique. This is where the paravane minesweeping equipment that New Jersey was originally outfitted with would have been mounted. In 1987, it was removed from this ship because of corrosion issues up here at the bow. The plan at that time was to remove it from all the Iowas as they came into dry dock. But the American involvement in the Persian Gulf, laden with Iranian and Iraqi mines from the Iran-Iraq War, meant that the Navy wanted to leave that capability on the other battleships. New Jersey never had that capability returned as such, but I think that's just okay. A battleship being used as a minesweeper is not the best use of resources. Besides, any ship can serve as a minesweeper once. From here, guests often ask about the caisson and the less than watertight seal that it gives us. But I always make them wait until we're back out of the dry dock before I tell them why that is. So next stop, we're going to climb on top of the caisson. 77 stairs down and 77 stairs up, several times a day. Throughout this whole process, I thought eventually I'd get into shape for doing it, but it hasn't happened yet. Maybe my next dry docking. Honestly, the first 4 stories aren't that bad. It's this 5th one that really gets me. All right, time for one last authenticity check. If you want the real dry dock experience, I need you to do 50 jumping jacks right now, or go to a flight of stairs and run up and down it 5 times, or jump rope, go run a mile, whatever it is that floats your boat. All right, now that you're winded, you're getting the experience of our last stop. We've just climbed up the 77 stairs from the dry dock floor to the top of the caisson. And from here, you can see how we're roughly level with the water and how the bottom of the dry dock is sitting something like 40 feet below the water line. The caisson acts like a separate vessel. It's not attached to the dry dock in any meaningful way. The water pressure of the Delaware River on the outside holding the dry dock up against the caisson is what holds it in place. So when we want to float the ship out, we have to flood 37 million gallons of water, give or take, into the dry dock. That will bring the level inside equal to the level of the river outside. Here's another realism addition you can add to this. The dry dock is right on the flight path to Philadelphia Airport. So every 2 minutes, turn on a really loud fan in your office, leave it running for about 30 seconds, and then turn it off again. So, the water level inside the dry dock is equalized with the water level outside, and then the caisson, which itself is filled with water, is pumped dry. As the water is pumped out, the caisson will rise up. This is why the shape of the dry dock is important. Earlier in the tour, I mentioned it is 114 feet wide at the bottom, 144 feet wide at the top. It's keystone shaped. This means that when the dry dock is floating up, it's not remaining in contact with the walls all the way up. Because it's keystone shaped, as it floats up, it is now separate from the wall and can be moved. So from here, a tugboat can grab the caisson, take it to another pier, leaving the doorway of the dry dock wide open for a ship to come out or in. Once a ship is in where it's supposed to be, the caisson is brought back and held in place by the tugboat. It is filled with water, allowing it to sink back into its keyway, so it'll come back down like this. And then the water inside the dry dock is pumped out, making the water pressure outside on the river greater to hold it in place. That water pressure sandwiches the caisson up against its gasket. The problem is, as the caisson was setting down into its keyway, the water was still coming in and bringing with it silt and debris. And some of that silt and debris gets caught between the gasket and the caisson itself. This prevents the caisson from getting a perfect watertight seal, which means that it's constantly leaking. But that's okay because there's a stripping pump down there. Really, there's two of them, but usually only one runs at a time. And that's just like the sump pump in your basement. All the water collects in the low spot here at the sill of the dry dock, and it's pumped to be recirculated back into the Delaware River. So as water's leaking in, it's being constantly pumped out. These stripping pumps are significantly smaller than the three main dewatering pumps that the dry dock uses for when it's draining the dry dock. So that concludes a dry dock tour of Battleship New Jersey in dry dock number 3 at the former Philadelphia Navy Yard, run by North Atlantic Ship Repair. If you have any questions about the dry docking process or any of the steps I just described, be sure to search our dry docking playlist for a video specifically about it. Odds are, over the last 77 or 70 some odd days that we were here in the yard, we've already answered that question in a previous video. But if you can't find the question answered somewhere else, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to support the ongoing restoration work on Battleship New Jersey. Dry docking may be over, but we still have several other capital projects in the works, such as completing the redecking of the ship and painting the above water part of the hull. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about the museum and our channel. Thanks for watching.